If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Fall of London, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. In the beginning of V5's life cycle, the books, all 4 of them, were published via the now defunct White Wolf Publishing and Modiphius Entertainment, the latter is obviously still going. White Wolf Publishing would develop the V5 core book, Camarilla and Anarch, whilst Modiphius would contribute by developing one and only one book, the one and only Fall of London. Released on the 5th of March 2020, Fall of London is a chronicle or adventure book set in London in 2012, where the recently torpid kindred rise from their slumber just before and during the Operation Antigen attack on the England capital and are tasked to aid in the resurrection of the ancient Methuselah prince Mithras, but the players don't have to, as the book provides different endings depending on their actions. On the surface, this sounds like a really fun time to me, someone who has forever begged for more British content in Vampire the Masquerade, as well as begging for Daddy Mithras' attention, but in all honesty, I have been dreading this review. I have ignored this book on the channel for the longest time and this podcast because, quite frankly, I hate it for so many reasons. Some of those reasons are truly subjective, while some of those choices made in this book are objectively awful. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they're presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. And finally, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway because there are going to be people who need this, I'm going to be spoiling the entirety of the book, so if you are planning to play this, maybe zoot this review out. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has a start of the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book, adorned with warm night shots of London at night, primarily of the Shard, dominated in the centre, and St. Paul's Cathedral to the left, with some tasteful blood splatters on the top right and left corners of the cover, serving as cloud substitutes. You, of course, have the World of Darkness coffee mug stain in the bottom left. As V5 covers go, this is a very striking and imposing one, having an interesting blend of the ancient architecture, the historic clashing with the new, much like the general themes of V5, the younger kindred having more influence and power than the dwindling elders who have either been picked off by the SI or called away to join the vague beckoning. Of course, the SI was not a term coined during the book's setting year of 2012, and that may not be a theme the cover artist and future art director Thomas Arfett was going for, but the powerful London landscape against the bloody red backdrop is one of my favourite V5 covers to date. Though I can't help but notice the rough font used for the word London being very similar to what would be used with Werewolf the Apocalypse 5th Edition 3 years later, which kinda lessens the impact of the urban punch the title has here, but that's just me. The back cover of the book is similar to what the future Renegade game books would do, which is to take the V5 marble and paint it one colour. Here we have a washed away browny reddy hue, which gives it a nostalgic hue, which is a tone I am rather fond of. In the top centre of the cover we have what is in the actual fact a ceremonial dagger, not some strange VTM symbol. The significance of said dagger will be made apparent later in this review. If you own the Camarilla, Anarch, Sabbat books and or the V5 core book in a physical format, you'll be very familiar with how this book feels and looks. The book uses a combination of illustrations and photography for its artwork inside the book, the styles older fans might feel a little alienated by as they scan the fine glossy pages. The majority of the art found within the book takes the form of edited photos, most of which gives off a stock photo vibe, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but isn't entirely a good thing either. These photos drip with atmosphere, and some of them do paint a believable version of London's nightlife, which I say as someone who experienced a fair amount of it in his teen years. However, that atmosphere also doesn't feel like the World of Darkness, though I do like the first image you see on page 4. It is through the illustrations that have a more modern World of Darkness flair to it, but not by much, admittedly, which I do find a little disappointing. That being said, I absolutely love the drawing spread across pages 188 and 189 of Queen Anne Bowsley and Monty Coven at it, done by the amazing Amy Wilkins, which is me amending the previous comment in my Chicago by Night review saying that it was her debut into Vampire the Masquerade. Once you've opened the book and flicked past the contents page fit with a short consent warning, you are greeted with the standard World of Darkness introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover and what you will find inside. Actually, that is a little lie, because there's very little one would call standard here, especially if you're a long-term fan of VTM and feel you have the story of Mistress down in your head. The Chronicle has you play as pre-generated characters, each with their own character sheet in the form of the third appendix at the back of the book. Rather than the usual run-of-the-mill neonate, they are ancillor, who are part of the Mithraic Mysteries cult, together known as the Heralds of the Sun. They are awakened after 70 years of torpor to aid in the return of Mithras, the bull god, which the book really gears towards the idea of Mithras being an actual sun god, going into great detail later on, depending on the player's reactions, how his blinding radiance is akin to the sun, rather than the traditional warrior god he has been depicted in materials past. But of course, the cult leader slash figure is going to be interpreted differently depending on the individual and the religion, but that was something that threw me off upon reading it. Another thing that I would say is particularly forced is the relationship between Roger de Camden and Mithras, which goes beyond them being close, working relationship for lack of a better phrase, to intense ancient lovers. Now, I just want to make it very clear, I don't have a problem with them going at it, I honestly would not see why Mithras would keep hold of Camden for as long as otherwise, but the execution of the dynamic honestly makes Camden look a bit pathetic, needy and weak in comparison, which he certainly isn't. I also think all of this information for the first Chronicle for V5, which has always been aimed for newer players and storytellers, and the assumptions it makes on the reader knowing about Mithras, bloody gods and diablerie is all a bit much. So we learn about Mithras and his embrace of Monty Coven, for lack of a better word, how the two battle out internally, quite literally, and how Mithras wants to reclaim London away from Camarilla control, akin to what was hinted at Beckett's Jihad Diary, but unfortunately is rather different. Then there is the book's plot device, the ritual of the transferring soul, which Camden in V5 did on himself to escape the wrath of the Giovanni, putting his soul into a different body with all the power he accumulated through his age, and now wishes to do the same with Mithras. This is where the players come in, as they have to go and collect the 5 ancient relics imbued with Mithras' energy to partake into the ritual and let Mithras return to 4th generation status and his full blood potency. Apparently, the ancient vampire who has been around for thousands of years only has these 5 special items, and only this one group of vampires in the many, many variants of his cult set up by Mithras across the world is capable of doing it. It is also bizarre that Camden is the one to conjure up this ritual, when you consider the fact that Mithras studied blood sorcery, then none other than Hakim himself. In short, throw out the concept of diablerie as described in V5, we have a D&D adventure to go on a scavenger hunt to bring back a demigod from the ashes. Great for D&D players transitioning into V5, but not for anyone else. On the plus side, the introductory chapter does give the ritual for you to perform in game. Now, how the fuck you're supposed to learn or use it is beyond me at this point, but it's beyond its initial plot device reason, so there you go. The chapter there goes on to describe London in 2012 from the Kindred perspective and who the key players are. There's a nice blend of the new and old Kindred cast with a return of interesting 4 sheriffs of London, amongst others of course. You have hotspots both fictional and real, as well as what Operation Antigen is and how it came to be, which is cut off part way through with double page spreads of stats of NPCs who may or may not turn up in your version of the game before carrying on with the super dump gimmicky antigen equipment and the only good thing that I have ever seen people talk about this book, which is the 6th threat level with 0 being everything hunky-dory, and 5 is barely any kindred remain, and you are 3 seconds of being sent to destination fucked. Why? Cause Mithras says so. Behind the scenes, he dropped the vital vampiric information to hunters that swelled into what would later become the vampiric Second Inquisition. I had hoped to find out why the secret organization informed the royal family and how they did this about a whole undead society is trying to undermine the fucking queen, which is daft as it sounds, but think of the ramifications. You don't just undermine the queen, you undermine a whole nation, but we don't get that here, as a lot of what happens is mostly stereotypical black ops, secret stuff from any action film, dictated by the imagination and immunity of the ST, which I find to be both a blessing and a curse. But going back to the threat levels for just a moment, I really like the idea and premise on how each chapter of the story takes in those different threat levels into account, making each playthrough of the Fall of London different based on this one singular mechanic alone. Aiding this is that the chapters of the story don't have to be played in the way they're presented in the book, which makes the Chronicle a very freeing and flexible one. Overall, I find this portion of Antigen a very difficult read because of the volume of information that is pushed at you all at once, on top of the Camarilla and Mithras information. On top of this, the cut-in section with the NPCs creates a weird disconnect with the rest of the text because of how abruptly and messily it is inserted and not flowing with the rest of the text. These sorts of themes happen a lot in this book, at least the Modifius version. I'm not too sure what Renegade does with it, but I'll get onto that later, which adds to the overall messiness of the text, which is something I find most people who read the book can agree on. You can also have plenty of typos and grammatical errors. There is also the use of blood points instead of Rausch checks on page 126, which is honestly just a tad careless, but also provides an interesting mindset of when this book was supposed to come out. After all that clunky info dumping, we begin chapter 1, where the PCs awake from torpor are introduced to a more knowing number of the Mithraic mysteries, learn what they need to know about themselves and the task at hand, and fuck around in London to collect the 5 pieces of Exodia, Mithras. Mechanically, it serves as the V5 tutorial, where the players learn their characters and how to function in the world, how to feed, etc. and so forth, which provides a handful of challenges as these kindred have been in torpor for 70 years, so have fun reminding your newbie players how they won't know what a mobile phone is. Additionally, as we will soon explore, this game is filled with the PCs experiencing flashbacks, for their memories are fucked, which is the only time V5 book outside of the core book has ever addressed the memoriam concept. There are many geared towards the PCs alone throughout the tale, which I'm not a fan of, as I do find flashbacks to be a lazy way of storytelling, especially in this one, as it is vital for the players to use these PCs rather than make their own. And on that note, one of these PCs is a Hakata character with an oblivion power exclusive to this book and no further write-ups on them as the concept was still being finalised. It's not a problem now as all that information is readily available, but at that time was rather shitty, I have to say. But I digress. The second chapter presented has the players meet up with Queen Anne Bowsley, the Prince of London, to collect the seal she holds from Mithras. Former lover, now enemy, she wants Mithras dead so she can properly assume the mantle of prince without his presence looming over her. Though the former lover / infatuation is not mentioned here, her being addicted to diablerie is, but the origin is a little different, but the fact that Mithras controlled her remains. Just one of many plot lines that have been altered to explain, for better or for worse, the new timeline of events, with the subtle changes to Queen Anne's and Mithras' relationship being the most interesting. In any case, the players attend Elysium because of course they fucking do, in the new Ventrue stronghold, the Shard, because of course it fucking is. The PCs can interact with NPCs, determine rivalries, learn about London today, and get hints of the ongoing Antigen events, which I feel was a nice way to goad the players into participating in the more social elements of VTM. With many ideas being suggested for the STs, which can be a little overwhelming to take in, and that is someone who has quite a lot of experience running VTM Tales, so I hate to imagine what to think if it's somebody's first time picking up V5 to run. Then there is the meeting of Queen Anne herself, who will aid you in your quest, but on the condition that you kill Valerius, her sire, which is a unique scenario. He is also the one that bombed and killed Mithras, another plot change that is more in line with the political backstabbing plane, and less with the hilarious tragedy of the fall of the ball god. Again, the players can dispose of Valeris in many different ways, with the book suggesting just a few for those who are so stuck or overwhelmed with choice. Though the book does touch upon it, Valeris is too fucking strong for these pre-gen characters to tackle head on, even with the epic weapons that Anne will give them. But of course, any ST worth their salt won't make it that straightforward, which is taken into account. I am more annoyed about the flashback the players receive when seeing her that aids in her remembering you, and the bizarre request to request these strangers to kill their sire. The following chapter, Chapter 3, is the one I'm going to plainly dub the Tremere chapter, as it focuses on what I feel is the only Tremere to be accepted into the cult of Mithras, Sri Zanza, who you may recognise from the Victorian age book London by Night. This chapter has a strong sense of world building existing within Southall, home to the largest Punjabi community outside of India, which is important given the focus of an Indian character within the tale. You hunt him down, learn about him through his character development, how he is ultimately more humane than many of his counterparts, and indeed he is someone of his age, through another flashback, which I guess would be fine if you interacting with them affected anything, but they do not, so it is pointless to experience the character development that way rather than just being told or find a note or some description. If you wanted to do a flashback, it would be better just to hand that specific player, as many of these flashbacks take them place in one character's perspective, a piece of paper of what happens rather than RP through it. I applaud different means of storytelling and wanted to try something different, I just think the method is just a bit shit. One thing I do like about this chapter is that the very end where Sri Zanza nearly frenzies and attacks a child, a descendant of his with a touchstone also, which, depending on the player's actions, could kill the child or totally fucking them up mentally, meaning they fail as a touchstone later on. The pre-gens do not have touchstones. How can they? Seeing this key feature V5 play out like this is a very good education tool if handled correctly. Following this, we have the Nosferatu chapter, as the player characters head into London's underground to deal with Richard de Ward, Nosferatu Primogen and Underprince, and it was he who uses ads to get people to explore his underground club, only to feed on them. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? Because he's the prince below, which isn't a new idea for VTM. There are many encounters to be had here, from his lost strangers, a wall-crawling Nosferatu guardian on the brink of foiling to Wasau if they haven't done already, and a ritual that drains your blood and raises your hunger cause fuck you. Jabs aside, it's an interesting setting and a different take from what was usually expected from the inclusion of the Nosferatu in VTM stories, as well as a focus on the hunger and the claustrophobic horrors of getting lost in abandoned underground tunnels. The chapter does capture the London Underground really well actually, and the photos here adds to that. The final part of the treasure hunt has the players travel to the London Mithraeum, also known as the Temple of Mithras, which is an actual thing you can have tours around. Players also explore the British Museum, home to all things that we stole. In VTM, it serves as a neutral ground, akin to Elysium. The Kindred have to acquire the Red Cap of Mithras, and the Grenellian are in, or however that fuck is pronounced, soon to join the Red List. Kindred's most wanted and being prevented from being called to veer the beckoning. I also find it a very tense chapter that can go up in a second, as everything feels like it's on thin ice. The write-up of Regina Blake, child of Victoria Atch, is fantastic, as she assumes power by actively not participating in Kindred politics, which, ironically, makes her the threat that intends not to be. Another thing I find interesting is the Nosferatu Daria has combo disciplines, both found on page 148, both of which I find fairly certain would get reworked for the player's guide. You also have the gangster NPC whose clan is Clan, my favourite clan. This, however, is not the final chapter, as the players now have all the quest items and now must decide, based on what they have done in-game, how they fit into Kindred society in London. Do they side with Queen Anne, or Mithras, or maybe Valorous, or do they just fuck off and leave for the forces of Antigen to destroy it all? The 6th chapter presents scenarios for each of these, with quite a bit of flexibility, including how well you did in collecting the objects of power, which I have mixed feelings about, all of which stemming from the beginning of him being depicted as a holier than now god of radiant brilliance. Sure, to me he is, but I'm a sub when it comes to Mithras. His oddly named Sabat pack are loyal to Monty rather than each other, because the writers are probably not allowed to include Sabat-specific terms here at this point. If anything, it would make sense for Caliper, Lice, Honey, Manticore and Feral, yes, that's their actual names, to go and claim the artifacts. These characters do not have their own stats, but use the Anarch Revolutionary stats from the core book and have a single sentence to describe them, unlike any other character mentioned in this book. There was also an opportunity to make the Sabbat shine rather than just stereotypical weird monsters, but Paradox be scared of the writers to sink their fangs into the Sabbat and explore monstrous vampires in V5, but I have ranted about that offensive simplification of the Sabbat before and cannot be asked to do it all over again. Just the writing for the Sabbat here is fucking lazy. However, the seeds left for the STs for Justicar Juliet Parr to clean up the mess and affirm London as a camera domain was subtle yet potent. What follows is one final chapter, which is the Epilog, which is my favourite part of the book and what ultimately made me buy this book. This chapter, some 20 pages, is what follows: who survives and who dies, how London could be shaped if Mithra survives, stays or fucks off to Edinburgh or feels the call of the beckoning. There is more information on London life again, law enforcement, and the underworld, as in crime rather than the literal underworld, to aid you and your players work out how to carry on playing V5 in this version of London by Night. This takes up the first appendix, with the second one being some half-decent lore sheets not meant to be used for the fall of London itself, but more modern chronicles, and the third appendix being where the information of the pre-gens are, in concluding with a map of central London itself. If I'm being honest, revisiting Fall of London for this review was not as painful as I thought, as I remember being very annoyed with its D&D inspired plot, with its myriad of errors, bizarre retcons, and over-reliance on the flashback-ridden amnesiac pre-gens rather than encouraging the players to make their own, particularly if they choose that Hakata character and have no real understanding on who and what they are. Now, I still do feel those things, and the way they handled Daddy Mithras will forever haunt me, particularly with how the Mithras/Monty dynamic worked so well in Beckett's Jahar Diary. My nitpicky comments regarding the actual presentation of the book may seem obsolete given the Renegade recently pushed out a PDF version, or at least recent as of the writing of this script, with a better formatting, something that fans had to find out by themselves rather than any formal announcement, but I would say that fixing a book 3 years after coming out, when most people who would have bought it or shared their copy of their book would have the Modiphius one, is a little too late if I'm being totally honest. That, and it ultimately doesn't affect the story, so if you don't like it then, you're hardly going to like it now. However, as I look at my Modiphius physical copy that I snagged off of Amazon before it went out of stock on the 22nd of January 2022, I read it with fresh, less angsty eyes, and I will say that Fall of London does have its moments where the storytelling can be riveting and compelling as the developers attempt new ways of telling and presenting vampire stories and chronicles within the World of Darkness, whilst overall feeling very rushed without one true voice editing the whole true package together. It is an interesting chronicle that does kind of hit the features of V5 that is pushed more so in other versions of VTM, even though I wouldn't recommend being the used for newer players personally. The amount of information one has to consume and remember when running this is also a bit of a task for the newer ST, which again, I wouldn't recommend if you want a gentle start into V5. However, where it excels is a toolbox for you and your players to conjure your own version of Vampires London, to take what works and doesn't work for you, know who was killed, died, went missing or reluctantly exist as you weave your own London by night. So, do I believe Fall of London was a bad book? No. But it's not great either. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book streetwise, open bracket, London, close bracket, 5 out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Instagram and Blue Sky pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.